the Investigator's Report, an in-depth look at some of the world's greatest mysteries and topics of interest. So for the next hour, we ask you to sit back, relax, and fasten your seatbelts as we explore and detail areas in our history, ancient history, biblical history, world religion and philosophy, and unexplained phenomena. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. This is Gary Pureford once again with another session of the Investigator's Report. And as always, we're extremely glad to have you with us. And we are also very exciting, if you have been following our blog page, to bring back a gentleman of which we have talked to on 2 other occasions now. In our first program, we had a basic Q&A. And in our second program, we discussed the origins of evil, the future of mankind in 2012. Well, ironically, here we are at the beginning of the year 2009, and we are talking to him for a third time. And between the last time we talked and now, he has put together an excellent piece of work in a DVD entitled Architects of Control. I may have misphrased that in my previous show, calling it Architects of Fear. It is a very, very masterful work done by my guest who is with us for the third time, so it gives me great honor and pleasure to welcome back Mr. Michael Tsarion. Welcome back to the Investigator's Report, Michael.
Gary, it's nice to be back. Thanks for inviting me back.
As I mentioned at the top of the show, this show will deal with your DVD, which is Architects of Control. And it is a very, very close look. I mean, a lot of the questions that we ask when we're talking about mind control, when we're talking about the New World Order, when we're talking about the nefarious plot, which has been going on for thousands of years, you seem to wrap it up in a nutshell in that DVD. And I'm going to yield the floor to you so you can give us an overview. As you know, I have like 3 pages of notes to use as reference of questions, but I'm going to go ahead and yield the floor to you and let you begin giving us an overview of the DVD, Architects of Control.
Well, thanks for that, and again, appreciate you having me on to be able to talk about the DVD. It's about a month old. It took about a year to make, and it's also just program 1 of a series we're doing in the Architects of Control, or entitled Architects of Control. That's going to be, several other programs dealing with this understanding of whether any of us are really truly in charge of our own destinies, or whether that's somewhat of an illusion, you see. Because, as we know, even outside the world of alternative research and conspiracy, even philosophers, psychologists, you name it, even religious thinkers, going back to, Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine, in every one of the major intellectual traditions, there's always been this question between reality and illusion. It goes back to Plato. It goes back before that, even into the pre-Socratic philosophers. It goes back to China with Confucius. My goodness, think of the Indian philosophers, of the ancient world, the great yogis. And you'll even find that in the shamanic tradition, or in the poetic tradition, not just the romantic tradition of poetry, but, all the way back to some of the earliest poetry, there is this sort of question. And we find it in the pictorialized in the great artists, particularly, the surrealist artists. Like, what is actually reality, And then coming up, this is an age-old question. And basically, do we just have an idea of reality? And if we have an idea of reality, then as George Orwell said, if reality is only in our heads, then there's a potential that reality could be manipulated as well. So the series is about that. It's about what is it that possibly could be blocking our perceptions of reality. And of course, don't forget, just imagine a moment that it is an illusion. We don't see reality. Just imagine for a moment that we are, in fact, like the Matrix movies implies, that we are in some sort of, illusionary state, and what we see has been either manufactured for us in some sort of vanilla sky Matrix kind of way, or maybe even if it's not that, it's just that we are not perceiving reality. Then you see, how could we ever find our way out? So the problem of the Matrix is that, okay, you may even start to realize or surmise that this is happening, or that you're, through various tests, this is what the philosopher Descartes tried to do of an evening, is try to test himself to see whether or not he could even perceive reality. And even if you get so far as to say, well, I don't think I am perceiving reality, I do think that a lot of the stuff I'm looking at is illusionary, what can you then do, you see, to get out of it. So this is not a small question. This is an enormous question. And it definitely ties into the world conspiracy because, of course, I believe we're dealing with architects of control. And you're not far wrong. You weren't really misquoting, because architects of fear is also what they're about, because there is nothing more debilitating to the human consciousness or the mind than fear. And, of course, let's subdivide that into fear and anxiety. Fear being, if we want to be specific about it, fear is more rational. Fear is like perhaps there is something external to you, that maybe is causing you a rational fear. Whereas anxiety, which is so much more important to know about, is an internal feeling, an internal complex, more nebulous, more hard to put your finger on. And anxiety often can arise from that which we know about ourselves. I'm constantly reminded of the movie High Plains Drifter with Clint Eastwood, in which he has this monumental line in which he says that it's what men know about themselves inside that makes them afraid. So again, he's actually being specific there about anxiety, and that movie actually was a comment on society and all sorts of other phenomena that we find in society, and sort of the heaven and hell scenarios that people carry within their own consciousness, you see. But in the first, even though this series is going to delve into these incredible questions, obviously the first DVD, we had to sort of not go too deep. I wanted to sort of lay out what we're doing, the tableau. I was very conscious of also newcomers, that we have to meet them halfway, because simply, practically speaking, we literally are getting, and I'm sure this happens for you as well, you're getting newcomers all the time. You're getting people who've been into this for about 5 minutes. They can easily become waylaid. They have a tremendous passion, but they perhaps not totally grasping all of the salient points. So we wanted to create a show, a film that actually showed, it was almost like a menu, so that when you walk into the restaurant, you can sort of see a list of stuff. Some you won't like, some you will. But at least we provide this kind of a palette for people to look at, and if some people who imagine that they are seasoned have a problem with that, well, that's just too bad, because, we're not talking to the choir, we're not talking about the people who know it all or think they know it all. We're always very conscious of the new people who are coming into this subject matter, that they need to be greeted, they need to be hosted, they need to be also, shown some of the salient points, the mythology, the astrotheology that ties into this, the mass control, the great teachers of the past. My goodness, what an important element there. So that it's not just Michael Tsarion doing his thing. Michael Tsarion is presenting you with some of the most amazing human beings who've suffered, who've lost, who've awakened people, who've dedicated their entire lives to this research. We should know about those kinds of people. And then you were talking also about the graphic aspect when we spoke earlier, and that was very, very, very important as well, because how many ways could you go about doing this? We didn't want to make it dry. We didn't want to make it left brain. We didn't want to make it like a tutorial. But of course, you have to give the information up, so it has to be informative. So, but how do you balance it? So I had seen a lot of what Henrik Palmgren had done, you see, with his other, he has a bunch of stuff that he's produced, mini films, mini documentaries, a lot of musical stuff, a lot of montage, and I just loved it. And so, sort of just talked him into like, hey, let's go with this. And he agreed. So it worked out great to have the animation, because there's something very powerful about that kind of animation when it's brought over into this particular area, because as we know, Big Brother's using it all the time. The Steven Spielbergs, the big special effects, super movies, the incredibly intricate commercials that they have, which are marvelously done with, the animation. They're using it constantly. I've often talked in my classes, especially to the children and in general, that maybe we should note down of an evening when we're watching TV and when the commercials come on, just mark down how many commercials show what would be called fantasy or magical acts. The latest Pepsi one does it, and many do. Does it show an angel or a giant or something magical taking place, a halo of light, moving objects, inanimate things that come alive and do little dances, you see. Let's think of anything that would be like a children's fantastical stuff where magic is actually happening. Just watch for that magical element. Of course, in psychological terms, that's called animism, the animistic aspects. And you will be surprised at how much the mainstream media use this fantastical element to appeal to the child brain, to appeal to the limbic brain, you see. So they're constantly doing this. They slowly dumb us down, further and further and further. Because as I've said in so many, works, this whole thing with the media, not alternative media like, the underground media or below the radar, but the mainstream media is one of the most pernicious tentacles of mass control. We wanted to get into that also to help the teens, to help the newcomers, and to help people in general always be reminded that watch out for what the media is doing, because these people don't mean you well. It doesn't mean it's all bad, but there is a campaign of colonialization. There's a campaign of colonization. There's a campaign of war on consciousness through all of these sitcoms, through all of this palaver that Hollywood, churns out, that's on the mainstream channels now, and captivates so many people. So it is deadly, very deadly, because that's where the person is most passive. That's when the person is most suggestive. I'm not against television. I'm not against programming. That comes on. There's some great movies and documentaries. We know so much. We've learned so much about the world from television. I'm not even against being passive. People work all day. They're tired. It's perfectly okay to sit down and be served, basically, just like you are at a restaurant. Watch a program, relax. I'm not against any of that at all. I never suggest that people should turn the television off, like so many, radical people do. I'm more for an educated response to what's coming over, and people can use it like anything to study it in a perfectly scientific and rational way. But it always needs to be reminded to people, you see, that the media is not so healthy in many of its aspects. So then we said, okay, wait a minute. It's not the manipulation, it's not the images themselves, it's not the art itself that's negative. So what are we thinking? Why can't we use that kind of imagery? You know what I mean? It can be done very well. If you watch the movie, What the Bleep Do We Know, or The Corporation, you see, there's been others. You can see the healthy use of imagery. I mean, I've been talking about it long enough, and finally I wanted to do something that really, basically was an example of that, so that we try to make a balance between the information, which is absolutely vital, and also how do we sort of accent that in a very artistic way, and can we get it to work? And as a matter of fact, as we start working on it, even by the halfway through the first, DVD, because this is a 2 DVD box set, by the way, we totally realized it's working, and then it was all steam ahead, We went out and did a lot of filming, and we did a lot of editing, of course, and we did a lot of animation. Henrik did, anyway. I was mostly looking over his shoulder, giving him a hard time, but it worked out great, this very shortly, 15, 20 minutes through, we realized, this is definitely the way to go, and it was just continue the process until the very end. And personally, I got to everything I wanted to get to. This first DVD also was meant to be an homage to several of my mentors, particularly Jim Keith. And, he was sort of killed under mysterious circumstances in hospital, and the jury's still out on whether that was a mistake or some sort of other weird happening. But he, in his time, you see, had written phenomenal books, very hardcore books, going for the jugular, talking about the facts, the absolute statistics and facts, and that goes on in MK Ultra, Project Monarch, and in all the mind control programs coming out of Russia, coming out of the old Soviet system, you see, that have been used entirely in the Soviet bloc for many generations, and are now leaking over here. He talked about the Tavistock Institute. He talked about Theodore Adorno, and he talked about the Frankfurt School, and things that American people need to really, really understand, because the campaign of mind control and mass control that's happening within America didn't begin in America. It's something that came in with Roosevelt. You see, it came in at a certain era, but it was actually manufactured in Britain. So it's another loophole. It's another red herring. Not a red herring. It's another, what would we say, clue, in a way, that can lead the American audience, you see, to understand who the real enemy is. I mean, I always talk about it being the British establishment, the British government, and the royals, and the whole royal establishment, you see, that is networked throughout Europe, and their deep desire to bring America down. And so by studying mind control and mass control, actually, and the roots of it, guess where it leads us? Right back to London, right back to Britain, and to some of the thinkers there. A very, very important study, this. So, the key thing is that we wanted to make this so much more film-like and much more animated, because that, I think, really accents and brings out the color of what we're saying, and helps the viewer participate just as you would, in any other visual medium. It helps you to participate with the right brain to get your imaginative circuitry working, so that even if you don't remember some of what we've talked about, you're going to remember the power images that we've used and the music that we've used, and this opens up, just like an eye will dilate and close, so does the brain work this way, and images help the mind to open, to feel more relaxed, and also to grasp knowledge in so much more of a sophisticated manner.
Well, one of the things that you did particularly well is how you began the piece with a lot of contemporary issues that we have faced, namely, starting with the subject mass control. You began to mention about the war on consciousness. Then you began to mention the mass killings that have taken place over the past, 10 years, maybe even more, starting with the Virginia Tech incident. You mentioned Columbine. And I'm going to have you comment on these. You mentioned Columbine, you mentioned Jim Jones, which ironically, folks, we're going to be doing 2 shows of dealing with a former member of the People's Temple in the last 2 weeks of this month, so you don't want to miss that. You mentioned David Berkowitz, a.k.a. the son of Sam, which is really the son of Samael. You talked about how the mass control led to a lot of these programmings and a lot of these triggers that were the catalyst for these events.
Absolutely, because you remember earlier I was just saying about the dissemination of fear. What better to disseminate fear amongst those who are sensitive people, the mothers of the world, the youth of the world, by this horror of seeing children die. This goes back to the Grecian times. It is a very old motif. There's something in human consciousness, you see, about child sacrifice. It's a very occult matter. It once used to happen physically. I mean, there's been cultures, who really went in for this kind of thing. It's not about blame game. It's about understanding why that might have happened. But there's something in the psyche of man. You see, the satanic force, or let's say more correctly, the Luciferian Atonist force, is very good on inverting, reversing the moral standards and the virtues that humanity has. They do this with their own members in order to compromise them, and they love to do it on a wider scale with this horror stories, you see, of these bizarre killings. We've even had recently young teens who've literally committed suicide on Skype while they've been on a webcam, like some sort of, we don't even live in reality, we just live in TV now. Everything has become what's called a simulacra, and the word means exactly what it sounds like, a simulation of reality. Of course, one of the other reasons, Gary, why they would be horrifying us with all of this, the Columbine-type scenario, is because that acclimatizes us, it acculturates us to global violence. Because remember, we're talking about extremely violent men here. We're talking about pathology. That's what the DVD series is about. That's what Architects of Control is all about. People who have no power internally, no control internally, no light internally, no virtue internally, and therefore the entire architecture of their life is in exactly the same way that you see somebody who's become a paraplegic has those braces on their legs, as a child needs stabilizers when they're riding the bicycle, as a tottering building will require this instant scaffolding, you see, to be put up, the braces. We have to start seeing these people as T.S. Eliot's hollow men, and being hollow, they require the external, you see, bracing. And therefore their power, their need for status, their influence, their need for a whole chest of medals and awards, this preposterous nonsense, and this ultimate involvement in hierarchy, which is completely anti-natural. But here's the crux of the matter. If you have, because of your own pathology, because of your own insanity, bought into the fact that hierarchy is the way to go and all society and all civilization should be hierarchical, well, that's an affront to nature, so it's not natural, and therefore you now have to continually maintenance it, because hierarchy doesn't stand on its own. It would be, something that would be eroded by the natural forces of nature, so the hierarchy has to be perpetually maintained. And the media is one of the biggest ways to do this. So that's why in the beginning of the particular program, Program 1, we went into many examples of this type of reportage. One, because I do actually believe that a lot of these teens were under direct mind control from the Dr. Cameron, Dr. Delgado types, you see, who are still in business, very interested in how the consciousness works, and because of the fear value that it breeds in society. And I have always studied these kinds of mass killings and also this serial killer type since I was about 13, 14 years of age. I've collected information on them. A lot of course, the ones in Britain and Europe, and then subsequently in America. And I do believe that a great deal of them have been long-term people who've been under mind control. And I believe that mind control has even been used on the presidents. I mean, we've even got videotape of that looks on, Bill Clinton's face and various other military generals and leaders. There's something very odd going on there. And we use these examples because we wanted people to really start. It's another loophole. It's another clue that they've left, actually. If you trace it, you can actually open up a whole window of investigation. Very, very important to realize that this does, in fact, go on. Also to realize that it's not going to go away. It's going to happen more and more and more. As I said, there's this recent spate of, the death of the young. And it's part of an occult ritual. I've talked about the occult ritual in most of my works, how even the cities are designed like ritual sites. When people open a book on magic and they see the magician, or the priest or whatever standing in some sort of, magical circle and ready to do his incantation and summoning demons or whatever, we've got to realize that's pretty much fantasy what you're looking at there. That is actually going on, but it's going on a macro level. The cities like Paris and Cologne and Washington, you see, and many other cities or parts of cities are ritualistic. This is huge in Ireland. My goodness, you wouldn't believe when you start getting into this thing when it comes to Ireland and England. It goes actually directly into the Templar organizations who did this. It's actually Templar Masons, stonemasons, Templars, Knights Templars who had this knowledge. They originally stole it from the Druids, but that's a whole other show, a whole other question. Then they appropriated and made sure that their cities, their designs, that's what the word mason means, for goodness sake, stone mason, a person who builds. And they've created a lot of propaganda, of course, so that we don't understand this point that I'm making, but these occult Templars had a whole, they had an entire library of knowledge about this. And with it came this idea of where you build, where you put certain obelisks, what the obelisks mean, the flags, the friezes, the squares, the clock towers. All of this stuff is happening in some sort of occult ritual. And therefore, many of the peculiar deaths, the way the bodies are laid out, the way the bodies are mutilated, the way the bodies are killed, other paraphernalia that happens to be lying around, you see, the corpse or whatever. And of course, the subsequent police cover-ups where, nobody can find out what on earth is going on. This has been going on for centuries. And so we went into the beginning, a little brief history of mind control, and showed that it's happening in our today's world. These are not freak things. There's lots of disgruntled teens, but they don't go around, with automatic weapons murdering people in school. We have this happening because they want to instill fear, and then of course they want to instill the surveillance community. They want to set up surveillance in such a way in which there's nothing you're doing is anonymous anymore or private. A total invasion of privacy, which is again part of the war on consciousness, and they're going to keep body punching us till we're softened up, you see, to basically buying into this whole surveillance culture that is already rapidly gaining great power, all over the world. And so there's so many incredible questions, that we can get into, and we did get into with that whole question of what's happening in our world and how ancient these forces are.
Folks, you're listening to the Investigators Report. I'm Gary Purefoy with my very, very special guest, Mr. Michael Tsarion. We're discussing his latest DVD, the first part of it, that is, of Architects of Control. Now, when I mentioned in a previous show, which of course was erroneous, but you did say that it was somewhat accurate, what came to mind was a Outer Limits episode entitled Architects of Fear. And what that episode was about was that the government actually created an alien. They created an alien in order to induce a situation or for mankind to come together to fight against this alien. With this particular project, another thing that you mentioned, which has been mentioned a lot on here in this program, you've mentioned it in your seminars and in your works, but in this DVD, you brought a whole fresh new perspective in terms of the idea and the programming that religion plays into all of this, and how really, and this was the key word here, how you compare the rational versus the irrational. Because for Islam, you have the Quran. For Christianity, you have the Bible. For Judaism, you have the Torah. And then these religions go into governments, and then these governments develop armies, and then as a result you have wars. But it starts with these particular elements of these religions, which they all claim to be holy. But I'll let you take it from there in terms of the comparison between the rational and the irrational.
Yeah, it's also a very key point. Remember we were talking earlier about that if in fact man is under mind control and he can't tell reality, but even if he starts to wake up to say, okay, look, maybe I don't see correctly, how can he escape? What can he draw upon within himself to then break the code and become truly liberated and free from whatever kind of mental shackles that he's under? My work is very much about that. My work is try to midwife a person, through this incredible labyrinth, the seeker. I'm not actually doing any leading, but the seeker, has guide. I put the sort of the signpost there, introduce him to these theories and thinkers and the great masters of the past, whether they're in art or poetry or philosophy, so that the individual can follow the light of the great masters who've gone before us upon this particular journey. This is very, very important because we're not alone. We never were alone. We've had the shining ones who've totally walked this road before. Human beings who've had the same questions, had the same anxieties, who's had the same, sense of questioning what is really meaning, what is really reality. And I think that the A-list of philosophers and the A-list of seekers who've gone on this road before us are very much disciples of reason. And this opens up a big door because, you see, then we have to ask, what is reason? And of course, it's basically nothing more than thinking. It's a certain kind of thinking. The rational faculty is something very, very special. It's the core of thought. Because thought happens all the time. Thought is happening when you go to sleep. Thought is happening even when you don't want it to happen. It's happening. But the rational apparatus is this highly focused ability that human beings only have. No other species we know has it. And it's the ability to discern. And I believe that a great deal of the reason, well, actually, technically speaking, the reason is basically judgment and critical thinking, critical ability, and the ability to discern or to judge. And however, it's also deconstructive in its nature, as opposed to constructive. In other words, it's like Sherlock Holmes. It's like a sort of a deductive method where you take a look at what is in front of you and you sort of eliminate the impossible. Now, talking of Sherlock Holmes, Conan Doyle basically said it in a very brilliant and succinct manner. He said, through his character, Sherlock Holmes, he said, once you have eliminated the impossible, oh no, excuse me, the quote I'm actually thinking of, he says, is that the truth is only arrived at by the painstaking process of eliminating the untrue. So to repeat that, he said that the truth is only apprehended or only arrived at by the painstaking process of the elimination of the untrue. And within that is something that is so profound. And this rings also through the work of Ayn Rand, you see, the great American philosopher, and Aristotle and many other, of the leading philosophers. The idea that it's deconstructive. You try not to attain truth directly, but you try to surmise what is not truth. This the mind can do. It is both presumptuous and it is possibly impossible to apprehend truth directly. And without getting into all the reasons why that is, it just happens to be a fact. You do a detection process. You simply test. You do have the ability, the mind does have the ability to test what is untrue in a Socratic way, in a rational way. Now, this would be where man would be at right now, because we had great lights and we had great philosophers, and this was pretty much the core of the rising of Western civilization. However, we have a counterpointing voice. We have a counterpointing ideology. And this ideology is, of course, anti-rational. It's the non-rational. It doesn't look at man as a rational animal. It looks at man as an emotional animal. And of course, he is emotional. But the interesting thing is that emotions can also be rational. So what we have here is a group of thinkers and teachers, you see, who only are happy to look at man as an emotional animal, as somebody who's not in charge of his own mind, whose perceptions are entirely illusionary, and that the only way to save that kind of man, you see, is through, various what has now become religious belief systems. And this is where religion comes in. It's actually really not even correct to call it religion, because they're not religion at all. Religion is something totally different and totally profound, and it's clearly explained in the Bible as to what religion really is. When Jesus talks about, going within, that the temple of God is within, and John and Corinthians, and so many allusions, you see, to the inner temple of God. And St. Paul saying, if thine eye be single, thy whole body will be full of light. The whole idea that the body is the temple of God. It's been written in many of the Christian scriptures, as well as the old scriptures that were left out of the Bible on purpose. And one of the reasons is because this is what these scriptures were talking about. But the fundamental fact is, you see, that we have to come to a decision ourselves in our own lives. There's no pressure. It's just like, we have to discover whether we want to be rational animals. And that does not mean not believing in God or believing in a universal intelligence. It doesn't mean that at all. This is what, the propagandists are trying to say about the rational people, is that, oh, well, this person's rational. They're debunking God, or they don't believe in and this, of course, is completely not true. But we have to be very careful that if we're always treated as emotional animals, as emotional beings, there's a danger at that point that we lose this critical ability and this judgment. We lose this deconstructive ability, which, of course, we have lost. And then we're open to manipulation. We're open to the promise. Whether it's in a fraternity situation like these Masonic orders, whether it's in religion in which they're constantly promising us enlightenment, freedom, heaven, you see, the eternal paradise and all of these kinds of things. They're not only promising something that we don't have now but we'll have tomorrow, but they're also saying that we will bestow it upon you. It's not something you attain from within. It is something that is conferred upon you. It is something that is bestowed. It is not awakened from within at all. It is something that is, bestowed by some external authority. This also is extremely, extremely dangerous, and has nothing to do with the concepts of true religion and true, enlightenment whatsoever. It's actually a form of submission and slavery. And again, my work is always about trying to help people discover not only about the architects of control that have co-opted our complicity, but what is it within human beings, you see, that allows them to submit or wants to be a slave? Why would we do it? Why would we enter into a master-slave dynamic? The roots of that question, you see, is in psychology, of what it is, maybe over time, or whatever way you want to look at it. What is it in human beings? Is it something that goes back to the way our parents have brought us up? Is it the way the schools are set up? What is it exactly that prevents a person, standing up for themselves and using their own brain and using their own mind and quickly submit? And of course, this question does not then only involve politics. There is a master-slave dynamic in almost every relationship that we could possibly look at. It's in the way that parents treat their children. It's in the way, adults treat one another. It's in the workplace. It's the way we treat animals. I mean, it's all the way down the line is this master-slave dynamic, and it needs to be looked at because the masters, the architects of control, know all about it. And as I said, they're busy like ants. In fact, they even use the ant. Many Illuminati families use the symbol of the ant. Others use the beehive, because the idea is of course, that this is a hierarchical, or at least in their mind they think it is, that these animals operate in a hierarchical manner. And as I said before, you have to maintenance a hierarchy because there's nothing natural about it. In holarchy, this was something completely different that the ancients understood. You don't need to maintenance that because it's self-perpetuating. In the hierarchy, you do. And just as a final point on this question about hierarchy, we wanted to really point out something in the DVD, and also I've done it in previous works, and that is that hierarchy. That's why they even have a symbol of the pyramid on the dollar bill, why the Illuminati and these Masons love the symbol of a pyramid, because that is exactly the most incredible symbol for hierarchy that you could ever want to create. It's absolutely the best symbol, the most brilliant symbol. The triangle will work just as well, but the pyramid is perfect. These layers and tiers of hierarchy, it's something there. And as we said, the hierarchy needs to be maintained. But the other important thing is that there is no such thing as hierarchy in the universe. And therefore, those who see hierarchy are demented. It's only a pathological, sociopathic, and demented mind that sees hierarchy. Now, you're not going to change what they see, because it is like some sort of Twilight Zone, outer limits situation in which these people, they could be staring right at it. It's like those drawings, like the two vases, and can you see the face or can you see the vase, or the picture of the old woman and the young woman, it's so fused together, and it's all about our perspective of what we see when we're looking. And this is what I'm really talking about, is that in the demented mind that's narrow, that's fear-ridden, that's anxiety-ridden, that's spiritually empty and desolate, not only will these people see a hierarchy where there's really holarchy, but these are the people who they also deeply want to infect everyone else with their kind of thinking. This is also very vital. And the person that sees holarchy, you could never convince that other person you see. So it's like having a sphere and having a pyramid. This is the two visual images that sort of are at odds with one another. Here you have on one side a pyramidology of people who just have the hierarchy, and of course that's a power dynamic, isn't it? You have to have people at the top, you have to have people at the bottom suppressing, and then you have the suppressed at the bottom, the oppressed people, and all their motive is, Gary, all that they care about is becoming an oppressor. They're not thinking of freedom, which is of course a misnomer that goes around, that people really want freedom. That's a myth. What they want to do is get higher up the ladder so that they can become the next generation of oppressors. That's how we bring our children up. We don't bring them up to learn freedom and to learn true expression. And I'm sure you noticed that in the DVD we went into this thing about the indigo children and the meta children, you see, as a sort of an example of what we should be doing. But we don't do that. We basically spread the contamination. And unfortunately, the leaders at the top, who are the most sick and psychotic of the lot, that's what they're doing. They want to, in everything they create, whether it's a corporation or a religious situation, they're dealing with this hierarchical manner because they have no inner stability. And just like we were talking about some of the dark side of religion a few minutes ago, the other thing that we have to remember about this demented psyche is that it is going to cling to those external forms of religion. They're just a husk. They have nothing to do with religion, really. They may be incorporating certain spiritual elements from religious groups and people of the past, but they themselves are totally exploitatory and totally fake. Well, who do you think goes there? Who do you think is attracted to that kind of emptiness? Is all the individuals who have been either raped of their own psyche, and they're not to blame, they have to start waking up, but all these other potentates, all this establishment. So my work, as controversial as this is, one has to go and expose this popery and the echelons of, even the Protestant religion and Islam, like you were saying earlier. It's inevitable. I don't want to do it. I mean, I wish I had something better to do, but, the point is that when you're seeking, like a detective, when you're on the trail of this tiger in the long grass, you don't know what's going to happen when you burn down the long grass. You don't know what you're going to expose. And it will take you into big government. It will take us into the questions of religion. And again, it's deconstructive, because the idea is that if you break down all the stuff that is false, it is only then from the ashes of the false and from the beautiful human process of deconstructing all the lie that the real roses of truth and freedom, you see, and reality grow. So people must never forget this. We've had too much talk about attainment, too much acquisitive spiritual ardor and passion, as if it's something that, that the God force is something material we can just sort of have. This is nonsense. You have it when you're totally ready, when your own inner garden is prepared, and when you've also done this deconstructive work, both on yourself and both in the phenomena that is presented to you by your five senses. You can subject all of that reality, that phenomena you see, to the critical ability, to the judgment, and All great mystery schools of truth, all great schools, all great teachers always worked on that. They worked on sharpening the reason, not weakening it. So again, when you see a society that is completely anti-rational, this is where the danger is, and that needs to be turned around, you see, because otherwise there is absolutely no hope. And you know, this is a culture that now that's building more prisons. You know, 2 million people incarcerated. What about the schools? What about the the colleges? What about the books? What about the learning channels? You know, they're becoming more and more hard to find because, of course, you don't want people. As I said, the rational aspect, right, the thinking apparatus, is being constantly eroded, and people are being constantly worked upon emotionally. This is what we find through the symbolism. So again, I'd like to give a specific example so people know exactly what I'm talking about. The flag waving, the symbolism that's used in politics and on television, you see, is working on you on a very base, lower emotional level. It's working on you through your lower appetites, the food, the water, the oil, all the necessities of life, the concept of motherhood, the concept of protection, the concept of security. A lot of the talismanic words that are being used. We go into all of this, you see, and show how over time, drip feed, drip feed, drip feed, this is a form of mass control. This is a form of mind control. Always working to make you feel less, to make you feel disempowered, to rise up the anger, to amp up your feeling of anxiety by creating fear externally and anxiety from within. Fear externally, anxiety from within. Then you have the fear externally. You go, more police, please. More surveillance, please. Anxiety within. More medication, please. More happy pill, please. Can't deal with my own emotions. I have so much difficulty working with my dark emotions and the way I feel emotionally. Forget about the reason, chump. Forget about working on the reason. I feel like, shit over here. What can I do with that? So man is being literally pulled. Like we said in the DVD, there's giant hooks that have been placed in a man's flesh, and he's being torn. He's literally inverted. He's upside down. He's standing on his head. And the emptiness is so profound, the spiritual emptiness, the moral emptiness, that the only thing that then is left for the controllers to do is to literally inundate our minds and our hearts with all the junk, you see, of the commercial world. Not that sensation is bad at all, but look at the state that we've come to. That even in a sensational way, we're an overkill. The mind is already frozen just from the stimuli of palava, that is manufactured for us on a daily basis, and they know that an overstimulated mind is definitely going to freeze. So that's where we're at right now. The apathy that people are seeing, the kind of shutdown that people are seeing, is actually coming mostly from that. It's coming from the overstimulation of stimuli, that is also freezing the brain, so that people have to slow down in order to process all of this constant, deluge of things, of images, of all sorts of, subliminal content and liminal content. And this then, again, pushes people towards dealing with the darker emotions. They don't want to deal with it, so they medicate themselves. And the object, again, is always, just like putting people in a physical prison, is to up the anxiety so that people cannot work rationally. They're not attracted to rational things at all. They're only attracted to that which is going to, satisfy the lowest possible level of desires. And this is the danger.
One of the things that you use very well in the film is a film that I'm very familiar. In fact, I remember when it first came out in the movies, 88, 89, was the science fiction film done by John Carpenter entitled They Live. And that movie was if you take a very, very close look at that film, and I'll let you, once I'm going to pretty much set up your commentary on it, because in that film, you see how the economy was completely obliterated. Banks were folding by the dozens. More and more people were becoming poor. I can tell you with absolute certainty, because I witnessed this myself, more and more people are living in the way that we saw those people live in that film, outdoors, on campgrounds, because, hell, you can live on a campground and pay a couple of dollars a week. People are still working, but they have to resort to living in these campgrounds because they can't live in their homes anymore. They can't afford them. And we saw this in that movie, They Live. And then, but all behind the whole scenario, behind the breaking down of our society, behind the disruption and the dissolution of the working and the middle class, was this group of aliens. And it was, like I said, if there was ever a time where that movie should really, really be viewed and taken very, very seriously, now is the time. And you illustrated that. Comment on that comparison, because we're looking at, like I said, we're looking at this happening right before our very eyes.
Absolutely. It's a remarkable movie. I think everyone should see it for what it shows, because it definitely talks about the psychic dictatorship, the war on consciousness, the loss, and the scene that you're talking about, where they in the middle of this incredibly built-up city, it could be Seattle, it could be any city in America, with all the high rises and all the million-dollar corporations that you see there. They're living basically as in a tent city type of situation. That always did strike me, because you see, I'm kind of ambivalent about where we're going, because you see, we have to face it that something is unsustainable anyway in this completely cuboid, square type of grid-like matrix that we live in, even from a simple social point of view, from a city design point of view. And so, in a way, as terrible and as desperate it is to see that people not being able to live up to the standards of the so-called corporate world and what have you, in a way, just like it was in the First and Second World War in Britain, people galvanized. One of the other things that you'll notice about that scene, what Carpenter is showing, is that immediately as soon as the protagonist arrives with his friend, that they're immediately asked, what can you do with your hands? Can you contribute here? And of course, the guy was a builder, constructor, and he was able to say, I'll fix a shower, I'll fix the shed or whatever, and do odd jobs. And so people were galvanized, and then for that work that he did, he was obviously fed, and he was clothed and taken care of, and had a place to sleep and stuff like that. So it's almost in a way. And don't forget, if we tie this into the amount, just let's look at even England, for instance, how many teens who are brought up in good homes, say in the north of England, it's epidemic how many have always, in the last 20 years or so, the habit to leave and go to London and just sleep under a bridge, and we call it dossing, in which they're paupers. But then when you find out what homes they came from, they actually came from quite good homes. They weren't all beaten up and all this kind of thing. And there's almost a certain drive in certain human beings that they just can't stomach the lie anymore. And then they sort of go and hope, in some very maybe even loose way, create this loose affiliation of people, and who are living out of their cars, who are living out of their vans. But even though they have materially copped out, or there's a poverty financially, these people are rich again spiritually, and they're rich again emotionally. And this has been seen many times when there's been enormous crisis in the world. There's many, many examples of this, that the galvanization of people on a more, because one of the most abused words, of course it varies state by state and town by town, but one of the most abused words is community. I mean, it's one of these talismanic words that's put around, just like freedom, justice, liberty, and all their other palaver. Well, community is also one of the most abused words in America. What community? What are you talking about? Where do you find it? It's totally nonsensical. The real community is completely erased right now. So in a way, there's an ambivalent scene there, which I draw people's attention to, is that it's you may have dropped out of the material, Apollonian, 9-to-5 type of regimen, and you may take a beating financially and so on. But you see, again, as I've said in all my work, and I think we did say it in the Architects of Control DVD, even if a man is chained to a wall, he can still be free in his consciousness, as many of the greatest heroes have been. So it's all about attitude. And if it takes it, that there has to be a scaling back. Because remember, let's not even get into all the reasons why America is suffering in this way, because of the apathy and because of the not doing anything, not standing up and striking against the unlimited immigration and the unlimited funding of Israel, or the unlimited outsourcing of jobs, and all of the various reasons. Without even getting into that, if there is a meltdown, and of course I also believe, most importantly, that the meltdowns are always artificial, just like you implied. They're always, purposely done by design to shake people up, to create more anxiety. They're not legitimate whatsoever. There's no possibility of any meltdown naturally through natural causes. But just say for a moment that there is a meltdown, or these recessions do come upon us. there's also a silver lining in the clouds. And if it takes it for people to have to lose their status in one instance in order to resurrect, you see, a true feeling of humanity, a true connection to nature, then so be it. In my book, I don't have the same relationship to death that most people do. I don't have the same relationship to loss, you see, and to sacrifice that a lot of people do. Because what I see a lot of people is that they're in cages. They're already in prisons. They may have chains of gold as opposed to chains of iron. But my goodness, look at the unemployment in America. America is trying to fund foreign countries and take care of foreign debt. Do you know how many mothers there are on welfare who go and picking up bottles to try and supplement their income? Do you know the unbelievable state, the health? People can't even, like Michael Moore showed in Sicko, that you'd rather get on a boat and sail and row over to Cuba in order to get your medications that America can provide at a low cost for their people. The amount of injustice there, you see, the amount of corporate extortion and confiscation is unlimited. And so if a person, in a way, has fallen through the cracks of that from an egotistical point of view and from a comfort point of view, that isn't very pleasant. It has its own traumatic, aspect. But you see, spiritually speaking, hey, maybe this is what it needs. It's happened in Europe. It's happened in the third world. It's happened in South America. But when you go over to the third world countries, you see people's eyes are shining. You know, when I went and visited in India, a little Mickey Mouse watch, it doesn't even work. It's like plastic, and you give it to somebody, a little kid, and their eyes are gleaming. You're their brother. They're going to remember you for life. You know what I mean? You give them a little margarine carton, and you come back in 15 years, and it'll still be there. You know what I mean? The gratitude, the sense of camaraderie, the sense of warmth, the sense of brotherhood. Unbelievable poverty, physical poverty that no American could ever imagine. It's just incomprehensible poverty. And yet the eyes are shining and the heart is rich. And so there are many inversions coming. There's astrological paradigms that explains all of this. And there's other ways to look at it. We talked in the Maya prophecy we went into in Disc 2 of Architects of Control to try and, look at the bigger picture of these astrological phase shifts. But even without getting into that whole thing, there are periods of time in which civilizations are born, they rise to their peak, and then they fall. And in between that, there's a whole other spectrum. And another way of looking at that is a sort of a reversal. This concept of reversal is very much in mythology. It's very much in the work of people like William Blake. It is something that happens in the dream state, where you have dreams of reversal. It happens in life, in which there are these tremendous upheavals, both in government and corporations and in human beings' lives, where they literally feel like, my goodness, they like the hanged man and the tarot cards, they've been totally reversed. They have a feeling of loss. And what does it show you? On the floor, on the grass, underneath the hangman's head, many of the tarot cards show, coins, bags of coins, or coins that have fallen out of his pocket, meaning that his material welfare is a little bit out of reach. But what does the hangman really signify? What is the Hebrew letter that goes with that card? What's the greater mystery? Actually, specifically speaking, it's the letter Nun, N-U-N, which always implied the ocean, the waters, the dissolving waters, which come in. And we even had Henrik did a brilliant animation of the waters, or maybe that clip was from a movie, I can't remember, in which the waters just come in and erase everything, that is known. And the rising of the waters is both a symbol of the unconscious of man, which can easily overcome the ego and can easily overcome consciousness. It's also a symbol of renovation. It's also the ending. You'll find the symbol of the coming in of the water in so many poetries and so many movies and so many fiction talking about the dissolution. It's also in mythology about the dissolving of one reality, you see, and then finally the birth of another reality. So Nun, the hangman, the symbolism behind that is that this is a positive thing. This is an oblation. It's like a baptism. Somebody has to be completely baptized and they have to die. They have to die to live. And so not just individuals go through this, but the point of the Architects of Control DVD, this first one, was to emphasize again and again that this also happens socially. These phase shifts are known to happen. We've not been told any of this in the Western system, in Western schools and in Western literature at all. But in the Vedic systems of India, which are, came there from the West anyway, and in many other cosmogonies, for instance, the Maya, the North American Indians, the old Celtic stuff, always talks about this rising and then rising to a peak and then falling. very much based on the Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva. Brahma being the creating energy of God, Vishnu being sort of a sustaining element of God, the protection and the sustainment of what is, and then the Shiva energy, Shivaic energy, that is the bringing of that cycle to an end. Not destructive in the way that we've been programmed to think of destruction, but be constructive. Simply the winter cycle, simply an idea that everything in order to be fresh and new must perish, must go through, must putrefy, die, and then be resurrected. This is such an incredible story about how this cycle works. And it happens within the ego of man, and it happens socially. And we're seeing mini cycles of it as well, because it's a fractal. Remember, it's a hologram. What happens on one level of the fractal is seen up the fractal and down the fractal. So some of this melting down that you're seeing, and we'll continue to see as we come down to 2012, a lot of it is positive. A lot of it, people should not get anxiety and traumatized about it. They should try to get with this, and they should try to understand that there is this sort of chastening element. There is this purgation that takes place, and that the people who are truly threatened by it are the ones who are simply accumulative. They're simply acquisitive, both spiritually and physically. They're not going to be able to understand and get with this vibe at all. They only know the yang, they don't know the yin. They only know the Venus, they don't know the Mars. Right? They only know the Sun, they don't know the Pluto. They only know the tonal, they don't know the nagual. So there's a whole tug of war going on here. And people need to realize that there is a yin-yang, and the civilizations go this way. And so it's perfectly okay to be in tune with those. The ones who are not, well, they break because they try to stand too rigidly, too strongly, and then, of course, they'll snap. But as the ancient Egyptian priests always said, there's been 1,000 holocausts. There's been 1,000 holocausts of fire and by water and by many other means. It's not something new. It's, it can happen, and it does happen.
Unfortunately, Michael, we are out of time, believe it or not. But we can go another hour if you like, but we'll wrap it up here, and hopefully we'll definitely, being that there's going to be another part to this series, we will definitely try our best to bring you back. I know your schedule is extremely busy, and we certainly appreciate the time that you've given us in this program. But again, we thank you for sharing all the aspects of the first part, mind you, of Architects of Control. Now, where can they obtain a copy of this DVD?
They can either go to my main website, michaeltsarion.com, and there's a link there, or just go straight to architectsofcontrol.com. There's previews there. There's if they come to my forum, they'll see, if they go to the What's New page, we've got excerpts. Because when I released the Architects of Control DVD, the same week we basically also released a 6-part DVD series on the Irish Origins book that I wrote. It's called the Irish Origins Civilization DVD series. There's excerpts on Google. So if people just put in Irish Origins of Civilization, these excerpts will come up. Or just go to my forum's What's New page, and we've already posted the various previews and trailers and excerpts of this, of both of Architects of Control and of the Irish Origins of Civilization, for those who are interested in that thesis as well. So they're all available online, and they can get to my forum by, again, going to michaeltsarion.com. They'll see a link there.
All right. In addition to the links that we already have for you, we'll get a link there for Architects of Control as well. Well, folks, like I said, we're out of time, but we thank you, Michael, again for being with us. Folks, we thank you, as always, for being with us for this session of the Investigators Report. We encourage you to be with us for our next session. But until that time, may the God of the universe bless you. See you next week.
You've been listening to the Investigators Report, which is a regular feature of this station and is produced by Garinger Research and Investigation. For more information on this program and for upcoming programs, and to even listen to past programs in our archives, be sure to log on to our blog page at theinvestigatorsreport.blogspot.com. That address again is theinvestigatorsreport.blogspot.com. We trust you enjoyed this informative and provocative program, and we urge you to join us next time for our next session of the Investigators Report right here on the Community Listening Network. to the Investigators Report, an in-depth look at some of the world's greatest mysteries and topics of interest. So for the next hour, we ask you to sit back, relax, and fasten your seatbelts as we explore and detail areas in our history, ancient history, biblical history, world religion and philosophy, and unexplained phenomena.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Gary Purefoy once again with another session of the Investigators Report. And as always, we're extremely glad to have you with us for another time, as true to our theme that we're now playing of our show, where we are playing with fire. And we're also very happy to be able to get a second part of our conversation with Mr. Michael Tsarion in connection to his latest DVD entitled Architects of Control. We had part one in our previous show. This is part two because there's so much material that we wanted to cover, which has brought us to this second conversation. I truly appreciate Michael for coming on again. And Michael, again, welcome back to the Investigators Report.
Thank you, Gary. It's a pleasure to be back.
As we left off in our previous conversation, we're going to pick up in this conversation regarding in the DVD and the film where you mention, because we've mentioned it here in this program a number of times, if not almost in just about every episode with every guest, giving recognition to what's going on, giving recognition to this activity of control and this whole system which we know to be the ushering in of the New World Order. What you suggested us to do is to get mad as hell. I mean, really, really get mad as hell. But what you went on to describe, which was very, very eloquent, was the different type of approach that we should take, the different type of intensity, and how we should approach that. And I'm going to yield the floor to you and let you begin there.
This is a tremendously important question, and it ties into the whole concept of solutions, because there are some people who, not being truly familiar with our work, give themselves away by, coming to us and saying, hey, we know the problems, why don't you offer any solutions? And the first thing that always tells me is that they're not familiar with my work, because my work is filled with solutions. Even to talk of man doing his inner homework and dealing with his emotions, just like we spoke on the first program, is that not solutions? Even to talk about legal means rather than political means of working towards greater freedom, and mentioning the breaking away from the federal government and the education into these matters of how the whole federal systems are set up. I mean, we have solutions. We're always mentioning solutions, but what you're asking specifically is about the difference between a reaction to what is taking place and a response to what is taking place. Then when you go a little deeper, you have this concept of anger. And a lot of people will talk about anger being a very negative emotion. You see, because again, as I insist in all my work, we've been told a pack of lies about all the emotions. We have a very paltry grasp of what emotion is, and the majority of Western people are not in any way in relationship or in contact with their own emotions. So all you get is the play of words. You get the play of words back and forth, and the cliches. Oh, anger's wrong, hatred's wrong, compassion this, compassion that. Righteous indignation is better than anger, and so forth and so on. And so you get this bandying around of words without any true, really substantial meaning. And I can give you a good example about that. The family who has had their sons and daughters brought back in body bags from meaningless wars, who've had their children raped by pedophile priests, who've had their entire family business, eradicated by, say, the federal system, who've been browbeaten by police, who've suffered injustice in court, who've had everything taken from them and robbed from them, who have had no sense of justice. And my mind goes back to the Jack Lemmon movie, Missing. People need to watch that and talk about whether this man should have righteous indignation or whether he should have had anger. You see? So we're talking about responses here. So it's very easy to talk about righteous indignation when the acts of confiscation and acts of extortion haven't reached your doorstep yet. or when war and turmoil and murder and rape and violation and injustice haven't reached your comfortable, middle-class doorstep, then you hear talk about righteous indignation. Well, people are sipping their wine and lighting their cigars and talking in totally abstract and general terms. But just like the Jack Lemmon character in the movie Missing, or just like the Howard Beale character in Network, when you truly see, or not just see, but have involvement, direct participation with the kinds of violations that are going on, like people in my country, and I can say this without even taking sides, the enormous atrocities where people are kneecapped, people are shot in their beds, women and children are blown to pieces. And you're telling me, that you have righteous indignation? I mean, what am I meant to do? Look that up in some dictionary or something to get an interpretation of what that means? You're mad as hell. And that's what is an actual, sane, rational response to a violation that is taking place on any level. When you bring a family member into the casualty ward of a hospital and they say, sorry, your wife or husband or son or daughter died on our operating table. You know what I mean? And just people need to sit and think about all the atrocities that we read about. You're going to talk to me about having righteous indignation? Or say you're made ill at work through some industrial disease, through exposure to mercury or some, like in Bhopal in India, or like in Chernobyl in Russia, and like there's so many other industrial diseases that are going on, and then slowly we find out, and you have organ breakdown in your body, and I mean any of the various horrendous injustices that have taken place. We just go home and say we have righteous indignation about these injustices. This is the luxury of fools. And when you take it to the macro level of the crimes that the British government is responsible for, and when you take it to the level of local government and what they're responsible for, and we have a world coming down. We have police surveillance. We have police monitoring crowds, and whether you're supporting or not mass movements and mass demonstrations, let's also notice the fact that anger is so taboo in our society. Isn't that one of the reasons why we have such a police control and such a watchdog jackboot control at these demonstrations? Is because that's what the society is so afraid of. That's what the Big Brother is so afraid of. They'd love you to have righteous indignation. They'd love you to work within the political pigsty. This is what they're this is what they're betting on, because they have nothing to fear from that. So they make sure that is completely, policed out of existence. And this whole idea of pacifying and having man have a very, very negative relationship with his own emotions, so that he is completely misunderstanding them. And that even a man who has true anger is a threat to society. They don't know what to do with him, because nobody in this Western world, as I've said in so many presentations and writings, has a faintest idea what a true, actual emotion is. They're not in relationship with it. They can't express it. And if they do express it, everyone thinks of them as a complete and utter nut. But to get back to the heart of your question, you heard me subdivide the question of anger, and that's because I've thought about anger. I've thought about these emotions a lot. And I've watched them in operation. And I will say that when it comes to anger, yes, of course, there is a dysfunctional acting out of anger. That's a no-brainer, obviously. And that falls under the category of what I refer to as always as the red flame of anger, because it's the anger that is infantile. It's the anger that appears when people's ego needs, their own narcissistic, basic ego needs, you see, are thwarted. And then they strike out like infants do. Obviously, that's not the anger that Michael Tsarion is addressing, like somebody who's come to this, 5 minutes ago. Obviously, that's not what I'm talking about when I'm speaking about the specific response that very few books and very few films have ever dealt with properly. And those who do are generally misunderstood. Just like when I'm talking about these things, it's misunderstood. And so, what is this thing about the warrior? What is this thing about the worry that we have about vengeance and justice? Now, the whole world is owed this because of the violations that have been done. And as I've said time and time again, mass placarding, mass demonstration with a bunch of people who have a very thin understanding of what is really going on is obviously not going to do anything. But a very conscientious, passionate, direct response from an educated group of people is the absolutely most frightening thing to the establishment. And that comes under what I refer to as the blue flame of anger, which is an intellectual anger, which is a response to being under attack. It is no different than the operations of the immune system and the operations of the white blood cells, the lymphocytes and the white corpuscles, when you're under attack. These emotions arise for certain reasons. In my work on, psychic vampirism and other subjects, we get into this even deeper about certain emotions arising for certain reasons. And so, until society has sort of cultivated that and basically, laid down this very tepid, very bourgeois sort of righteous indignation line, which is, of course, again, born out of either a completely thin understanding of what the facts are, or it's born out of the fact that the individual who has this righteous indignation is actually part of the problem and it will never be able to do anything about it. This is one of the reasons why people have this very cool and cynical responses, because they're actually either part of the problem, or they're never in a month of Sundays ever going to get with what is really about real change. And if you examine these people's lives, as I've said many times, instead of finding the anger and the criticism and the passion, what you find is a tremendously wet, damp, cold cynicism, a completely selfish, narcissistic cynicism, which throws water on real action. And you find these people in society, and you find them very much put off by the work that people like myself do. They're always talking about it being dark. They're always talking about it being pessimistic. I'll tell you what dark is. Dark is ignorance. In fact, many people have even philosophers have said that there is a correlation between darkness and ignorance. And believe me, those who speak against and think what the work that people like myself is doing is somehow dark and spooky and weird and a bit strange, these are individuals who are living themselves in a cloud of darkness, haven't the faintest idea what real change means. These are the very individuals who are going and out of their misunderstandings, voting in the worst tyrants possible and trying to sort of cop out of the real work that needs to be done. And, you don't find this in those people who've had true violation in their life, true injustice. You do not hear them talking in these terms, in these passionless terms. And again, I refer people to the movie Missing with Jack Lemmon. Go and get that movie and watch it and see. Put yourself in that character's position. Or get out Brotherhood of the Bell. We have that movie. It's on Google and YouTube. Brotherhood of the Bell with Glenn Ford, you see? Or V for Vendetta. And look at the movies, what these scriptwriters are trying to tell you about this incredible subject. And it's all, like we said in the first show, and it's a good question to open, what we're talking about in this particular interview, is all, again, is articulated to man's own relationship psychologically with his own emotions. If he doesn't understand his own emotions, if he doesn't understand why these emotions arise and what is emotion, and how many levels there are of these different kinds of emotions, if he just believes what he's been told by the spin doctors, then obviously he's never going to have the right tool for the right occasion. It's just as simple as that.
Folks, you're listening to the Investigators Report. I'm Gary Purefoy with my very, very special guest, Mr. Michael Tsarion. This is our second part discussion of his newest DVD entitled Architects of Control, and we were just mentioning about the differentiation from the red anger and blue anger, which should be our response in recognizing the right and true response to what is happening in our world today. And Michael, you also touched on, which is something I read on your site as well, in connection to psychic vampires, because I bring up this particular point that you touched on because it seems that there is a glamorization in our society, not only as of recent, but as for the past quite a few number of years, with the whole idea of the vampire. Kind of give us a brief overview of psychic vampirism, how it works, and have you actually witnessed it yourself?
Well, it's a fascinating subject. I really hesitate to go in too much in depth to it because of how many avenues it can take us down, and also my work is still I'm still working on a DVD and work on this. I've done lots of classes in it and other talks and writings, but it's something that is an aspect of the psychological work, looking into. Basically, all I can say in reference to what people might be familiar with what I've already done is that this is a situation in which it arises out of the concept of the inauthentic self. We've talked about this in other writings and presentations about man living an inauthentic life. And of course, there's different degrees of inauthentic life. It's like a spectrum. Some people are, getting it together. They're not so bad. They're looking deeply at different reasons, you see, why they're not in selfhood, why they don't have strong boundaries, why life isn't working for them, and they're getting with it, and they're progressing, and every day is a new day of adventure and discovery. So they're not quite as bad, They're looking for the authentic life, which is, of course, connected to a man's selfhood, the purpose and reason of why he's here. And then, as I've shown in my work on pathology and how it works with the conspiracy, you have the other end of the spectrum of basically the self-murdered person. This is somebody who has no spirit at all, going not with a religious idea or interpretation of spirit, but with a psychological idea of spirit, which is that spirit is not something you're given at birth. It's not something you come into this world with. It's something you create for yourself through the experiences that you have. Soul, spirit, is something you develop yourself. It's like that you bring alive from within yourself. You're given the spark of life by the Almighty intelligence, but spirit is something you gain from your experiences here in this world. Just as everything else in your body grows from a natal state into maturity, so does your spiritual self. It's not just installed at the moment of birth and there you have it. But unfortunately, there are people who either because of, again, terrible violations that happen to them in this life, or just some other warped psychological reasoning, you see, are self-murdered. And we have these emotionally self-murdered people in their millions walking around. In fact, if we really showed the statistics, we'd probably be horrified at just how many people, you see, are not living in they're not alive in a moral or spiritual sense. They just have the mask, they just have the persona. And then these individuals are very adept at living off the energies and light of other people. So that's why the term vampirism has been used. It's quite an accurate term, actually, in many ways. And it also ties into this whole idea of the figures that we find at the top of the hierarchy, who would be so toxic, like we mentioned in the previous interview we did, that the problem with these people is that, see, they're also self-murdered, they're also toxic, and therefore they require not only the false religion as a front, as a cover, as some sort of sham to hang on to give the, just like you put marzipan on a cake, just like you put a false mask on somebody, they require this because they don't have any of the real light. They don't have any of the real spiritual energy, so they require a sort of counterfeit camouflage, just like the tiger hides in the long grass. And also they very much require status. They require the power that they have over other people, not power over the self, because they don't have any power over the self. There is no selfhood. The self has been murdered, self-murdered. These are deeply self-sadistic people, and therefore, they require the outer trappings of control and power. And of course, it goes thousands of years ago back to the Taoists and Taoists and the great philosophers. They always spoke about that the man who has true power doesn't require any control over other people. So the very manic need for these people to set up these exploitatory edifices, as we said, corporations are psychopathic, meaning the controllers, the people who create all sorts of corporations. I believe there's a great deal of psychopathy behind these different fraternal orders. Maybe not the street level masonry, but certainly on the higher levels. My goodness, if you studied these orders as much as I have, it goes without saying that there's a psychopathy there. You see? So it just like any corporation, just like any organization, and just like any individual who has great status, who absolutely, literally will jump through hoops to have the world bestow physical awards, physical medals, physical honors, and so on and so forth. You see, physical wealth, because they have no wealth within. So you also meet this on the more, let's say, street level, humble level of people walking around you. And of course, you won't notice it. These are people, you can't pull out a meter with a nice little needle that will, like some sort of, tricorder out of Star Trek or something like that, where happily and beautifully and luckily, Mr. Spock will be able to go, watch out, Captain, psychic vampire loose. And everybody can have their, boundaries up. Unfortunately, people are married to such individuals. People work beside them every day of their lives. People give birth to such creatures. People have them as neighbors. People have them as superiors. And unfortunately, there is no meter. And the only meter that you have is your own intuition and your own deductive abilities to observe them very closely to find out, okay, is there something slightly different here? But of course, this kind of knowledge, you see, is very absent in the world. And we're still at a sort of a spinner rack level of psychology when it comes to analyzing these kinds of people. Psychology does know about them to a degree, but it is very paltry. It's not in depth yet, not too much. And so there's a lot we need to know about this kind of person and how they might operate and how this kind of vampirism works on all of its different levels. And this is what, education I'm committed to. Very fascinating subject. And as I said, we do have a meter. We do have the ability. These people will betray themselves, but we have to be observant of that fact. And in the study of the psychic vampire, we're actually studying humanity. Because, as I said, it's deconstructive. Once you understand what a human being is not, you have a greater understanding of maybe what a human being is. By the analysis of what it is not, all the various corrupt forms, you see, all the various counterfeit forms, once those are analyzed and discarded, like we said in the previous interview, once you've eliminated the untrue, you'll be left with a sense of the true. And this is essential in some of these studies that have to do with the inauthentic life, with the systems of control, tying in exactly to what we said last time about the inability of a psychopath to see hierarchy. Well, you see, the psychopath will simply not see it. So no matter where they look, they will see hierarchy. And that is already, and the fact that they're adamant about it is the sign of their dementia. So it's just like a person who's got Parkinson's, it's no point expecting them to be able to, hold the knife and fork. Unfortunately, the body functions just don't allow for that. So in exactly the same way as a physical ailment will preclude somebody from climbing the stairs or cooking a meal, or bathing themselves. So in exactly the same way as a mental disease is the same sort of, hindrance. It's just not possible, for a person with one leg, to beat the 4-minute mile. It's just not possible. So in a physical disability, we understand it, but with a mental disability, we don't understand it. But we need to start understanding that people with that kind of a disability are not going to be clear and deep in their understanding of the nature of the universe. It's simply not possible. Their understanding of life, their projections upon other people, their understandings of other people's motives, their understanding of how the systems of the world work are going to be deeply flawed. These are not rational people, and I don't care how many university degrees they happen to have. That has no bearing upon the facts at all. If a person is demented, they can still be intelligent enough to jump through hoops to get some worldly awards. In fact, this is what you often find with people who are megalomaniacs. They do possess enough skill to be able to, manipulate people and to go along to get along in the school situation, or maybe win awards politically, you see, so that they end up getting power, because these people want power more than any other thing. So they're willing to sacrifice, they're willing to do hard work, they're willing to manipulate and worm their way up, until they have an actual sense of power. This turns them on. This is very, very important to most of the potentates and the criminal syndicates of the world, you see, who operate in such a sadistic manner, not caring how much genocide, how much mayhem, how much misery they bring to the world. Again, if we do not know how to isolate a psychopath, that's about as good as not being able to identify a mad tiger hiding in the long grass who's ready to just eat all your sheep and kill your children and abduct and murder and just go mad. Some wild, crazed out beast. You're in exactly the same predicament. And this is unfortunately where we find ourselves today.
There was something that you pointed out in the DVD also, almost in connection with that, as far as where we could be headed in terms of, this control apparatus, which is one, the annihilation of consciousness, because you mentioned the difference of the authentic versus the inauthentic. And with the annihilation of conscience, you talked about the usage of pharmaceuticals and medicine. And as you were describing, when I was viewing the DVD, and as you were describing this particular aspect of the presentation, I kept thinking, because there was one segment where you had a clip from a talk show where a husband was saying that they were talking about Prozac. And the husband was talking with the host in connection to his wife. He says, well, isn't your wife better? She doesn't get angry anymore? He says, yes. Well, isn't she more manageable and more agreeable with you? He said, yes. But he looked at her and said, but that's still not my wife. And so you see in that incident a prime illustration of the annihilation or a sense of inauthenticity of a person's individuality. Talk about the usage of pharmaceuticals, which you also fused with alchemy, and how you made those connections even with our past historical characters in the rock industry, such as Morrison, Hendrix, and Osborne, and others.
Well, yes, I remember that scene, and I must say it's one of the most moving scenes both me and Henrik and anyone that we've sat with and watched the DVD through, both mechanically in order to make the show, and also later as just sitting and watching it objectively. That scene is horrifying and yet incredibly illuminating, the scene that you just referred to, and I'm glad you brought it up, because you see, and even if you watch the mannerisms of the wife who is on the drug, you see this incredibly effervescent, confident, happy person. Yet the husband, is thinking that where's the real wife, So in other words, what he's got here is something that conforms on paper to a societal model. This model, which is the theme of our work in the Architects of Control, where did that model come from? Who has contrived to create this societal model of what is normal? Is it the schools? Is it how they have, set that up? And is it the media in which they've given us these models? And you're quite right, we'll get to the idea of who these rock star models are and how that's all contrived as well. And not all, but a great deal of it being contrived. But yes, is there something about the fact that we now are living in this simulacra, becoming more and more artificial, having Big Brother dictate who and what we can be, what we have in our relationship to our emotions and our relationships to other people, and the political correctness that's all around, which takes away our own common sense? All of these factors, you see, that move us towards this sort of perfect man, this perfect new man concept. And then if you fit that model, he or she fits that model on paper, and all aspects of true individuality, all aspects of true imaginative expression, unless of course it's commercially viable, are erased and eroded, and you fit this nice little prepackaged, basically artificial model, then you're considered normal. And of course, let's not even get into the whole thing of this horrendous, concept of the modern world in which it's broken, fix it. And meaning that, you fix it with pharmaceuticals, you fix it with this superficial topical stuff without going to the root of why all these maladies arise, all of this. But even if you fit this model on paper, then you're considered normal. But as many of the post-Freudians like Arno Gruen and other psychologists have shown, especially R.D. Laing and Wilhelm Reich, so many of these people have shown, even Freud himself showed, that look, if society is abnormal, if society is neurotic, if society is violent and abnormal, or by your conforming to these models, then aren't you conforming to an abnormal model? And is that why we have abnormal people, abnormal emotional people, abnormal intellectual people, abnormally morally walking around in the world? And religion is definitely having a hard time trying to then pick up the pieces and make sure that people remain within a moral framework. And of course that gets weaker and weaker and weaker all the time. Or religion has to become even more and more, you see, in its own way, rigid and uncompromising in order to do something about this tremendous falling off, you see. So one thing affects the other. You see, it's all part of a fractal. You can't affect one bead on the thread without, affecting other beads. So the ship of state becomes utterly chaotic. Everything's upside down, so it becomes like Alice in Wonderland. So in that scene, that's what you got. That you had a person who was running away from her emotions. She was definitely not going to look at them for whatever reasons, because of her own past or because of her own relationships, and mostly it is to do with the relationship with the self. The person starts suffering tremendous anxiety. That anxiety prevents them from working right, so then you have stress at work because you can be professionally compromised. And therefore, once stress builds up, it's a feedback loop. You never seem to be able to get out of the loop. And of course, don't we know about approval? Seeking approval from other people is one of the most stressful things that could possibly be imagined. Living up to the false models that society is demanding. So before we even fail to live up to it, which is one syndrome of problematics, we're even trying to live up to it, which is already the first problem, that you even spend your whole life in comparison and trying to live up to these unbelievable, fake models that people are putting up there for us in regards of professionalism and the status and looks. I mean, all the way down the line, they're waving this stuff in front of us. And then the more pernicious result is that when we find that we can't live up to these, we don't say, well, that lets me out. I'm free then. I don't need to be doing this. I'll just be as I am. No, we become neurotic people because it's the superego, it's the conscience within us that puts so heavy demands upon us that the little ego in the end just can't do it and then feels terribly, terribly browbeaten. In exactly the same way as some overseer, punishing you at work. You're not good enough. You're not good enough. You're not good enough, or some sort of father figure or some very punitive voice. We all carry that voice around in our heads. And so after a lifetime of that kind of, punishing voice within our mind, which again is technically our conscience, and the sense of guilt that we live under, we can't handle it. So there's a break. The human being becomes neurotic. And then if you're neurotic, you can't function in society. So society, knowing this, knowing that more and more people are becoming neurotic, it's not just something of the last 10 years, it's many decades old now, they then prescribe these pills. That's what they are. They're just the happy drug manufacturers. They are the harlequins, the Pied Pipers who come along to fix you from the outside. But what this does, of course, is it might make you conform to a certain model. It might bring you so far out into the surface of yourself that you're totally estranged now from your unconscious. You're estranged from who you are as a true human being. You've completely lost your purpose. You're totally a conformist. And only the closest people around you are going to notice that you're hollow and that there's something missing. And that is, again, a definition of the self-murdered person. But their satori, their bliss, comes from the fact that now they are the perfect worker. Now they are the perfect robot. Now they are the perfect, participant. The perfect slave, the perfect number, like Patrick McGowan showed in The Prisoner. You have now learned to conform. You've now learned to perform as the world sees you, and everything that's being created today, that's basically what a new world order is. That's what the global community is in its essence. Even if we forget about who's creating it and what kind of evil is motivating them, that kind of, and we've seen it in science fiction. We've seen it in portrayed in many science fiction and other futuristic films, that in that sort of Orwellian conformist dystopia, and believe me, it's not going to be a utopia because it's impossible for demented people to inherit anything positive. So this is just total fiction, pipe dreaming. As we said in a previous interview, they always talk about order because that's the last thing that they really have inside. And so it's all rhetoric. It's all propaganda. It's not an order. It doesn't even look like an order. Hierarchy is ultimately not order. Hierarchy is a violation of the true order, but if you don't know that the true order exists, and if you've never happened to study hierarchy and you don't know how the nature really functions, well, then you're going to be so conditioned by what man has created, what the scientists are saying, and all these ancient, useless models of the universe and of how we participate, that of course you're going to see hierarchy there, because that's, it's like Vernon Howard, the American philosopher. He said, the man who does not understand what it means to be under psychic hypnosis is already under it. And that is an extremely profound statement, and it solves, it makes a lot of sense when you look around the world. Then what you were talking about is the idea that the society, in order to give us this conformity, are very adept at throwing up the various people's champions. And in the DVD, we didn't have time to explore them all, but certainly the politicians, and then we also explored in the pop culture. And the pop culture is very important because that also deals with the youth, and the youth are very impressionable. The youth don't want conformity, of course. This is just because their energies are over the top, so they are looking for rebellion. They're looking for iconoclasm. And therefore, it's very vital that the society, the controllers, put up false models of that. Because the last thing they really want is a true revolutionary, a true, Malcolm X type of person who's going to totally go against the system and really try to do some fundamental changes. That is the last thing that they want. And they've had people like that rise up. And they've known the danger that it can potentially have. And therefore, they put their own Pied Pipers up there with the image, the fashion of being radical, rebellious, and different. 5 minutes later, they're up at Buckingham Palace, at Prince Charles's birthday party, or they're down on their blinking knees. We already talked about how it's reprehensible for an American to do that, but even leaving that aside, you'll find these pop culture people 1 minute with their designer, beards, and their long straggly hair outside 10 Downing Street, browbeating the Queen or browbeating, the Prime Ministers, and the next minute they're receiving the highest awards of the land from those kinds of people. Is there something wrong with this picture? Anything right with a picture of the punk movement wearing the hammer and sickle T-shirts and earrings and piercing themselves and having these ugly pictures of the Queen with her ears pierced and everything like that helps vent a whole culture, a subculture's pent-up frustrations, and the music, of course, helps to do this. And the next thing you find is that these people are living like pashas in Bel Air, and fleets of Harley Davidsons and whatnot, and receiving awards and working for charities all over the world, and shaking hands with prime ministers and presidents, and owning corporations, for goodness sake. I mean, does anybody ever want to wake up and find out what on earth is going on here? This seems to happen as a matter of course. And that even other whistleblowers from within the music business who come out and tell you what's going on, you don't hear it, you don't believe it. So we've got something off here. And it's very important then to look at all the different ways in which this particular cult of Dionysus, because again, this is not a new thing, this is a very old thing. You not only have the king and the heads of state, but you've got the jester. And you've got the person who's the entertainer. And you've got the person who, the sophistry, the sophists, who go out there, and because the people are not sophisticated, you have the dumb show. This is the propaganda of the ancient world in which the minstrels and the bards and even the plays were put on to sort of mimic what was going on in the court. Well, that's what you have today. They know you're not going to get it intellectually. They know nobody reads. So they insinuate the media and certain popular figures with this information that they want to have disseminated. And the expertise you see of MTV and of PBS, we were just talking earlier about this righteous indignation. Well, that's where you need to go when you have righteous indignation. Just watch PBS, then you'll be very happy. You'll be in your element. And these are marvelous people, people for dumbing it down and spreading it thin and putting it out there and basically disseminating this lie in an extremely sophisticated way. It varies, of course, based on media group, and it varies based on even country, but that's what it is. It's the old Sergei Eisenstein, Vladimir Lenin, Soviet understanding of use the media, use the people's champions to dumb people down. And this is the kind of thing that you have going all over the world. There's been many movies that have brought this out as well, about how this particular game works.
Another thing that you pointed out, and just to kind of make a comparison or an example of what you just stated in terms of the contradictions of these rock figures who engage in these charities, like, for example, Bob Geldof. He was the one who began the whole idea of aid for Ethiopia, aid for Africa, the Band-Aid, which did the Christmas song back in the 80s. And then from that started the other efforts on behalf of third world countries, and then we have Farm Aid and other kinds of aids going on. But interestingly enough, Geldorf was the spearhead of that project of aiding Ethiopia because Great Britain was the country that raided Africa and was somewhat responsible for their plundering. But yet we see him in your DVD, like you said, getting an award and basically yucking it up with the Queen. I mean, kind of touch on that a little bit.
Well, that's right. These people, we have to be cautious and a bit on alert when we see these people who are meant to be the people's champions, 1 minute talking about revolution and 1 minute talking about the crimes of government. And then the next thing, you know, they're owning corporations, they're given status, they're either up at Buckingham Palace, you know, getting knighthoods, some of them quite elevated knighthoods. And it's not just awards for great talent or great services to the arts or whatever, you know, which is sometimes nice to receive or whatever. We're talking about, you know, a bit of a dichotomy here, that these are individuals who's, like the Pied Piper, they take you on a long journey, around the block and up through the fields, and everyone thinking, yeah, these guys, you know, they mean business. We're going to see some real change here. They're going to get into the dirty little secrets and dirty big secrets of government, that we're going to see real change. And the next thing you know, they're walking straight up to the houses of the same oligarchs, the same aristocrats, to receive these awards. People only need to look at the guest list at, you know, Prince Charles's last birthday, I think it was last November, to see the kinds of how it's sprinkled with all of these different, you know, pop stars and personalities. They're very well known in the mainstream. And I've always, from the time of back in the 70s, late 70s and 80s, had questions about these people and about their allegiances, because I didn't see any true rebellion or true iconoclasm about them at all. Now, of course, as I said, that doesn't mean that everyone who goes to get an award from the Queen is in some way complicit. And it certainly doesn't mean that everyone in the rock business who just happens to wear black or have a bit of a dark image is also, you know, a true Luciferian or whatever. So one has to take every individual case as it comes. But over the years, when we see the A-list of these people and how closely affiliated they are with the oligarchy of England, I've certainly got questions there. I'm really interested to find out why that is. People like Sean Connery, for instance, you know, who has been given a host of very illustrious awards by the French government, and you know, one wonders why. Is there some sort of Knights Templar connection there? Is he connected to old Templar families? Is there something behind the scenes that we don't know about, where all of these incredible honors are given? And now we have people like Angela Jolie, you know, being given all of these positions of authority within the United Nations. Again, people's champions. They're put in front of us originally to get our allegiance, to get the young people to give them allegiance, and then the next minute they're around there shaking hands with the worst, you know, syndicate murderers, these top politicians, and kowtowing, and looking for, you know, status and authority within those circles. This to me is a highly spurious and very, very dodgy, and it sometimes makes my blood boil to see it, because I know it's so fake. These are people, you know, if they knew the histories of the world, if they knew what these criminal syndicates were doing, they would never go near them. And I've always said in my work, it's reprehensible for any American who calls himself an American to do it. You know what I mean? It's outrageous that this would happen. And you have many dignitaries, from Giuliani to Bush to Clinton, you know, there's a long line of people, Schwarzkopf, Colin Powell. There's a long list of people who've been given awards by the royal family. And that to me is tantamount to treason, actually, in an American context, and it's little better. It's a little better in any other way. And you're right. These individuals suddenly own corporations. I mean, 1 minute the punk movement or other rock personalities are wearing hammer and sickle, talking about humanity and free this, free that. We're behind the ANC. We're behind the IRA. We're behind the Native American Indian movements. We're for peace and love and granola. And the next thing, they themselves own vast corporations, are seen getting knighthoods from the Queen and sitting on the boards of big giant corporations, you see. I mean, wait a minute, is there something wrong with this picture? In my reading of it, there is. And Bob Geldof especially is a very, very, to me, dark character. There's been murders around him, and there's been campaigns of cover-up to hide his complicity. There's scandal, and his wife was murdered. He's connected to the death of Michael Henchard from In Excess, and there's a smokescreen, a big cover-up to cover up his complicity, and God knows what other seedy things he's involved in. He's a most loathsome character. Actually comes out of Canada, actually. He's only partly Irish. And these Bonos and people like that, I've got big questions about who they are and the kind of imagery and symbolism they were using even in the earliest days. Groomed, initiated, because remember they also have to prove themselves as well, so they're put through a certain level of initiation, in exactly the way movies like Brotherhood of the Bell and other movies show you. And how these people's champions are used, let's turn to the movie even License to Kill, one of the James Bond movies. Those movies, I believe, are whistleblowing movies, even though they've got a lot of preposterous elements to those films. If people watch them with educated eyes, especially go to License to Kill with Timothy Dalton, and you have the Wayne Newton plays an interesting character in that movie where he is a religious evangelist, sort of a people's champion character, and they show how he's being used to manipulate people to give allegiance and how to give money and donate, and how these corporate criminals and these mafioso types use a public face. Now, we know that this public face has been used, even the Dirty Harry movies have brought this out. There's been so many movies have gone into this, how there'll be a public front. The police know this. The police authorities know that there's criminal conspiracies and that front men are used. And it's no different with the Dionysian cult. It's no different with these people, and we have to have serious questions. Because the last thing that the system wants is for a true rebellious iconoclast, somebody like a Malcolm X, to come out with charisma, to turn people on to something different, to investigate things, to potentially very much endanger the status quo. They know that this has happened in times past. They know it can happen again. They know that there are truly rebellious rock bands out there and truly rebellious characters who deeply care about the injustices that are going on, and they do expose it in their music. So the last thing they want is for somebody like that to really stand up, So they try to compromise those bands so that they don't make it, or that the controversy destroys them, or drugs, destroy them. This is what Alex Constantine, in his book Covert War Against Rock, when he shows about the death of Jimi Hendrix and the death of Brian Jones and Jim Morrison and also Bob Marley, these are very likely to be assassinations in which these rebellious characters, because they know that Jimi Hendrix, for instance, was a big supporter of the Black Panthers and black freedom in America, and this irritated, the special forces and the different FBI movements and the counterintelligence groups in America. Same with Bob Marley. He was a thorn in their side, They don't want any minority person from the backwoods. They don't want anybody from the gutter climbing out with an incredible charisma, with an incredibly God-inspired, energy about them, with a tremendous talent. These like solar children. And they want to co-opt them. They want to co-opt those people so that they can be used as Pied Pipers. And when they're approached with all the money and the women and the gold and the fame, and there are certain men like the Jimi Hendrixes of the world go, well, you can shove that where the sun don't shine because I'm not going to buy it. That then makes these controllers mad as hell, and they used to respond by even campaign of assassination. This is what we go into in the DVD, and I believe it very much was in the case of Jim Morrison, Brian Jones, Bob Marley, and Jimi Hendrix, and there's a lot of other people as well that they do this to. And also then on the other side, don't forget that when you are a Bono and you are a Geldof and you're rubbing your hands with glee, that now you can have diamonds in your boots, as they say, and you can have all of these trappings. They want to make sure that they shower those people with awards so that it sends a ripple effect message down to all the other lice and all the other punks, all the other creatures moving up within that movement to say, here's how you play the game. We're not even stopping you from wearing ripped jeans and being a bit of rebellious. It's okay if you're George Michael or you're Prince or you're, Michael Blinken Jackson. We'll allow you a certain amount of rebellious imagery, because it's nothing but imagery, as long as you know how the game is really played and when to lower your eyes. Then we'll shower you with awards. You'll never see a day in court, even if you should, your excesses should go too far. You'll never see a day in court because we'll protect you. And as long as you keep good with us, keep faith with us, you'll never be fed to the lions, So we've got major questions about these people because they are Pied Pipers, they are waylayers, and it's important for the young to know about it and to be analyzing their lyrics and analyzing their symbolism so that they're not entrapped.
Well, we have about 7 minutes left, and I want to touch on a question that I asked you after our first show off the air, because it seems to all draw to this conclusion. First, with the annihilation of self, the disassociate behavior, the replacement of human beings with other types of human beings, if not even robotic human beings. Then with that being culminated as you were running that down and as I was coming toward the end of the DVD, I began to think of our horror genre in regards to zombie pictures, such as the remake of Dawn of the Dead, such as the 28 Days and 28 Weeks Later films, and even the George Romero films, where we actually witness mankind devouring each other. And I began to look, is there a connection between this imagery that we're being suggested or being exposed to and this nefarious plot?
Yeah, those movies are very interesting. I'd studied film myself for about 10 years in America. Didn't have the finances or resources or ability to take it, where I wanted to go and to go to actual film school. I was able to only do it on a community college level, and then from there on, I, studied it assiduously on my own. And I read a lot of course, film critical books, and many of them dealt with these types of movies that you're talking about in a very positive light. They actually were incredible to read about how the directors had a very specific, point that why the zombie devours the human flesh, why the zombies are often milling around in a big mall type situation. A lot of parallels to show that it's not really about zombies. These are the grotesque elements of the film, but actually, the filmmakers talking about this is the kind of consumerism, and these are comments on the consumerism and the artificiality and the utterly selfless person. The person who is living on the surface of themselves, the person who is addicted to fashion, who is obsessed with fame, and is a totally, utterly psychically demented and deranged individual. This is what we're seeing in the young girls now, how they try to live up to these models, the models of the models, and how all these rotten companies coming out of Europe, these fashion companies, who I believe are thoroughly controlled by the Illuminati. I look at their symbolism as enough to tell you that. I've gone into that in great depth in my DVD, The Subversive Use of Sacred Symbolism, where I show how the symbols that they use are necrophiliac and anti-feminine, and also lots of symbols, like of the red rose and other, well-known Masonic and Illuminati symbols, all the way through all the astrological symbolism. We looked at all of that in the commercial space, and this again gives these illusions of wealth, these illusions of prosperity. Now they don't even hide it. They can show characters on sitcoms now that are actually loathsome moral creatures, and happily show you that this is the way to be right now, to be treacherous and deceptive, and narcissistic. Even Steven Spielberg, his latest sitcom, he's creating a sitcom, about a person who's disassociated, in which the main character is actually a schizoid person with about 3 or 4 different personalities, for goodness sake. It's almost become a joke. And we know that the various TV shows have become a little darker, a little more forensic-based, a little bit more necrophiliac, actually. This is we've seen a trend of this. And it goes back to when we see these zombie movies, they have this message. But of course, don't forget that in the horror genre, there's a lot of whistleblowing as well. It's not everybody's cup of tea, of course, but there's a lot of whistleblowing there about society and about what man is when the mask has come down. Because this is what you get some directors who want to look at that. It's like the old Alfred Hitchcock era, but a bit modernized with some of the more grotesque elements of modern cinema. But I believe these movies are a very powerful comment on about what's going on in our world today, definitely.
Well, Michael, we are running down the stretch. We only have a few minutes left, and with those few minutes that we have remaining, I think it's also noteworthy for us to really, really make the case for our listeners to go out and get this DVD. We have a link to your website, which is architectsofcontrol.com. And also, in addition to the links that we've had for quite some time now, to your website, michaeltsarion.com. But again, folks, I really urge you, this is a must-view DVD. If you thought Zeitgeist was a great piece of work, this is 10 times better. If you thought Esoteric Agenda was a great piece of work, Architects of Control is a DVD that you certainly must get your hands on. And with 2 minutes left, Michael, I'm going to let you close it out with some parting comments and other additional information.
Well, mostly to say that this is an ongoing series. We'll be doing others. We're just about to begin filming on the next one in the series. And you're right, it does go deeper than a lot of this other topical stuff, because again, knowing the problem is one thing, knowing the potential solutions is another. The diagnostics needs to continue to always analyze what the problems are, but we always have to be solution focused, and we have to be very wary of getting into cliques, and we have to be wary of sort of stopping on the road of discovery. This is not possible in any subject that really matters. Is an ongoing discovery, and what my work is especially noted for and emphasizes is that not to leave consciousness at the door. These things that are happening in the world, the phenomena, are simply not just economic. They're not just social based. They're not just political based. We have to understand what the connections are to psychology and also to pathology. And again, to emphasize that we're not Luddites. We're not against technology. We're not against TV. We're not about success. We're not against any of this stuff. It's just that kind of power in the wrong hands is what we're against, and therefore, like anything, like any subject, needs to be diagnosed properly, and that requires a lot of scope. You can't just focus on one particular area. So the more eclectic we remain, I think, the better. And people need to open their minds, use their synapses. I believe in the underlying intelligence of people, that they can handle it. They can handle all of this stuff and they get savvy with it all and go from there. It's a fascinating study. It should be always seen as an adventure, without panic, without any type of pessimism, and without any type of anxiety or fear, because that's exactly what is the mind killer, and it's exactly what Big Brother wants us to be in that state. They do not want us to be in psychic immunity. They want us to be in a total state of anxiety, and this is what people need to very much watch out for. This is a journey of discovery. It's what our life is all about, and there should never be a trace of fear or pessimism or doubt at all. There should be plenty of skepticism when it comes to the content, because we're not professing ourselves to be right or anything like that. But, this is, again, an alternative type of research, and people have to adjust their settings. It's going to be controversial, and it's not going to be, mainstream. It's not going to be something that's, naturally exposed to or familiar with, So, but again, thanks, Gary, for the opportunity, to elaborate upon the creation. We've had a lot of questions from people, so it's great to have the time to go into depth into some of the areas of the making of the DVD series. I really appreciate that.
And we certainly appreciate you, as always, coming on the show. And like I said, I think to check in with you once a year is certainly worth that time of waiting, because when those months go by, there's always some great projects that you engage in your interviews, in your seminars, your talks, your DVDs, and many things. So again, I urge the listeners, please get your hands on this DVD. There's also some special features in the DVD where Michael is interviewed discussing the making of the film as well, in terms of the things we discussed here on the show. Well, again, Michael, we thank you for being with us. And folks, as always, we thank you for being with us for this session of the Investigators Report. We encourage you to join us for our next session. But until that time, may the God of the universe bless you. See you next week.
You've been listening to the Investigators Report, which is a regular feature of this station and is produced by Garinger Research and Investigation. For more information on this program and for upcoming programs, and to even listen to past programs in our archives, be sure to log on to our blog page at theinvestigatorsreport.blogspot.com. That address again is theinvestigatorsreport.blogspot.com. Well, we trust you enjoyed this informative and provocative program, and we urge you to join us next time for our next session of the Investigators Report right here on the Community Listening Network.